by 2025, half the kids born will be diagnosed with autism.
The United States is the sickest country in the world. This is the sickest generation of children to ever exist. In America, we have the highest medical care costs of any country in the world. There's a danger of wiping us out. That's the most critical damage.
The question we must ask ourselves is why? GMOs, taking a stand against Goliath to save the future of our food. Food, the foundation of our existence. Food keeps us healthy. Food keeps us alive. In 1994, the Bush administration capitulated to heavy lobbying by the biotech corporation Monsanto and took a stand to deregulate government control over the industry.
Call me, we're in a dereg business.
The result of this changed the course of history. Monsanto began genetically modifying food. Unrestricted by any government regulations, genetically modified or GM food was released into the public food supply without any warning, labels, or safety testing. The public began consuming GM food without their knowledge or consent. Today we face one of the greatest crises ever known to mankind. If left unchecked, we travel down a collision course with sickness, death, and the possibility of extinction. What is a GMO? The World Health Organization has defined GMO as organisms in which genetic material, DNA, has been altered in a way that does not occur naturally. There are two basic types of GM food: pesticide producers and herbicide resistors. Pesticide producers are plants that have pesticides built into their DNA. They kill insects by exploding their stomachs when eaten. The second type of GM food is herbicide resistors. Herbicide resistors are plants that are resistant to the herbicide Roundup. This plant allows farmers to spray Roundup to kill everything in the field except GMO plant. GM foods are created by taking a gene from one species and inserting it into the DNA of another species. This gene insertion process is random and rudimentary. Inserting new genes disrupts the gene sequence of the plant's DNA, leading to abnormal plant functioning. Consuming this plant can produce allergens, toxins, carcinogens, antibiotic-resistant diseases, and nutritional problems. Monsanto spent millions of dollars on advertising campaigns convincing the world that 1. GMOs would feed the world by increasing crop yield, 2. GMOs would end world hunger, and 3. GMOs would save the environment by reducing herbicides and pesticides. The main types of GM food crops today are soy, cotton, canola, corn, sugar beets, and Hawaiian papaya. After the Bush administration deregulated GMOs, the biotech industry released them into the food supply without any credible safety testing. The FDA's position on safety testing was that it is Monsanto's responsibility to ensure that the foods marketed by the firm are safe, wholesome, and in compliance with all applicable legal and regulatory requirements. In direct contrast, Monsanto's corporate communications director Phil Angel stated Monsanto should not have to vouchsafe the safety of biotech food. Our interest is in selling as much of it as possible. Assuring its safety is the FDA's job. So who is responsible? Neither the government nor Monsanto would accept responsibility.
People are being told, now don't worry, there's no problem with GMOs. Well, frankly, people were told the same thing about tobacco years ago and devastating effects.
In 1996, Britain wanted to establish a safety testing protocol for GM foods. The man assigned to create this protocol, Dr. Ibhad Pushtai, fed rats genetically modified potatoes for 10 days. The results were alarming. The rats' organs shrunk and their stomachs had precancerous cell growth. When he released his findings, he was immediately fired, his team and protocol disbanded, and he was silenced with the threats of a lawsuit. 15 years later, Dr. Seralini conducted the only long-term study ever done on GMOs. This study fed genetically modified corn and the herbicide Roundup to rats for 2 years, resulting in organ damage, grotesque tumors, and high mortality rates. Most tumors became grotesque after 18 months, the equivalent of 45 human years. These rats are as prone to tumors as humans are. Dr. Seralini published a study in 2012. In 2013, the study was retracted after a campaign of criticism by the biotech industry scientists. So who is Monsanto? Monsanto was originally a chemical company, producing saccharin, PCBs, DTTs, asparagine, RBGH, and Agent Orange. Monsanto has a well-established history of certifying each one of these products to be safe. In reality, each one was actually toxic and hazardous to human health. After Vietnam, Monsanto had a huge surplus of Agent Orange, so they modified the active ingredient in Agent Orange, glyphosate, to create Roundup, the leading herbicide used around the world today. Monsanto then rebranded itself from a chemical company to a sustainable agriculture company. Monsanto claims Roundup to be safe, though studies show otherwise. MIT scientist Dr. Stephanie Seneff has linked Roundup in GMOs to numerous diseases such as cancer, infertility, Alzheimer's, birth defects, diabetes, and autism.
Roundup is the most important toxic chemical in our environment. When you are exposed to glyphosate in your food, you don't feel an immediate reaction. It's a very slow kill. So some of that glyphosate ends up in your proteins, in your tissues, throughout your body. And wherever that glyphosate goes, it messes up that protein that it gets stuck in. And this is how you can explain it causing a whole bunch of different diseases that seem unrelated.
With Monsanto's heavy marketing and promotion of Roundup safety, Roundup quickly rose to be the #1 herbicide in the world. Monsanto's goal is for the entire world to use GMO seeds. Control oil and you control nations. Control food and you control the people. How do you control the food supply? Control the seeds. In order to accomplish world domination of seeds, Monsanto's first task was to have GM seeds deregulated. In 1992, Monsanto convinced the FDA to issue a policy categorizing GM seeds to be the same or substantially similar to its natural counterpart. This was called the Substantial Equivalence Policy and meant that no safety testing or labeling of GM foods of any kind was to be required. As a result of this policy statement, the substantial equivalence theory became GRAS, generally recognized as safe in the United States as well as abroad. There are two criteria for something to be considered GRAS. First, it must have peer-reviewed studies. Second, there must be an overwhelming consensus among the scientific community that is safe. GMOs had neither.
There was never any peer-reviewed scientific proof offered that these foods are safe.
In fact, the FDA's substantial equivalence policy was adopted over the objections of the FDA's own scientists. FDA scientists voiced concerns that GMOs were inherently hazardous, different from conventional breeding, and requires careful safety testing. The FDA scientists believe that the foods cannot be presumed safe. The FDA's decision to implement GMO policy was a political decision, not a scientific one. Then the US government went a step further. It granted Monsanto a patent on all of its seeds. Plant patents may be granted to anyone who invents or discovers and asexually reproduces any distinct and new variety of plant. Monsanto's own definition of a GMO is that the genetic makeup is altered to exhibit traits that are not naturally theirs. If a plant is so unique that it qualifies for a patent, it would fail to be considered substantially the same as its natural counterpart. How was Monsanto able to play both sides of this diametrically opposed issue? The answer is simple: corruption. Monsanto has its employees in many different places of the government. A classic example is Michael Taylor. Michael Taylor was an attorney for the FDA. He then became a Monsanto attorney where he wrote the FDA's substantial equivalence policy. He then returned to the FDA where he approved the policy he wrote. He's gone back and forth many times since. The last position he held was the FDA's Deputy Commissioner of Foods, ironically nicknamed the U.S. Food Safety Czar. Scientists, lawyers, Supreme Court justices, and many politicians have been former Monsanto employees, and have gone back and forth between Monsanto and the government. This is so common that it actually has been labeled Monsanto's revolving door. Monsanto's stronghold on the U.S. government has been impregnable for decades. Carrying through the Obama administration, Obama signed 2 laws into act last year: H.R. 933, the Monsanto Protection Act, and H.R. 1599, the Dark Act. H.R. 933 was nicknamed the Monsanto Protection Act because it bars federal courts from being able to halt the sale or planting of GMOs, no matter what the safety issues or health consequences are. This is a precedent-setting limitation on judicial review and power.
You have to wonder, in a democracy, you're just being told, eat your genetically engineered spinach and shut up.
H.R. 1599 was nicknamed the Dark Act. Deny Americans the right to know. 90% of Americans want GMO labeling. States such as Vermont began passing its own mandatory labeling laws. Other states started to follow. In one fatal blow, Monsanto preempted all states from being allowed to pass labeling laws by striking down the state's right to do so with a federal preemption. Instead, labeling will be governed federally by an incomprehensible system of QR codes, URLs, or providing 1-800 numbers. This is really a non-labeling bill disguised as a labeling bill. 63 countries require mandatory GMO labeling. 3 countries have completely banned GMOs. The American consumer is a last resort to stopping GMOs. Boycotting GMOs will affect the industry in the most powerful and vulnerable way possible: the profits. Just as the consumer did in Europe, refusing to buy GMOs sends a powerful message to Monsanto that we are not guinea pigs. We are not a human feeding experiment. Ultimately, we have the power to take down Monsanto's GMOs. Take a stand. Just say no.